afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute delight to be here back in Mumbai. The last time I spoke to the Tata Festival, I think, was 2015, and our wonderful dear friend Anil Darkar, I'm so sad to be not seeing him, but anyway, it's absolutely wonderful to be back. I'm so delighted that the Irish Consul General is with us this evening, and oh, there you are, Anita. I've got lights on me, so it's very hard for me to see you. And I'm going to be talking about this man called Gerald Aungier. And the story of Gerald Aungier, which is one that I sort of got to know when I was the Vice Provost for Global Relations at Trinity. We used to visit Bombay, oh my goodness, every few months, and I got to know very well a lovely man called Cyrus Guzder, who was the honorary Irish consul. And as a historian, I said, tell me about the early history of Bombay. And he said, yes, there was a very important man called Gerald Aungier who helped to found the city. And I thought, that's a familiar name. Anyway, it turned out, of course, that Aungier was actually Aungier, and so began my love affair with Gerald Aungier. And I have a clicker that is going to help me move these slides, I hope. And there we are. There's Cyrus. He's not in the audience tonight, is he? He had the best St. Patrick's Day parties, I think, in India. They were absolutely wonderful. So, a couple of things. I'll talk about Gerald Aungier this evening, but a lot of my comments this evening actually have fed into a much larger project, these James Ford lectures, which are lectures that I gave in Oxford in 2021, except, of course, I didn't give them in Oxford. I gave them online because it was at the height of COVID. So they're actually all on the website of RTE. RTE is the Irish National Broadcaster. So some of what I'm saying this evening, obviously, I'm talking about Aungier, but if you're interested in the context and that relationship between Ireland and Empire, there's another 6 hours waiting for you. Also, I have written quite a lot about Aungier in a book entitled Making Ireland English. But it was really Aungier's brother I was interested in there, a man called the Earl of Longford. And I'll talk a little bit about the Earl of Longford in a moment. So, Aungier is clearly a hugely important figure for the history of Bombay. He was the second governor, but he really was the founding father. He was also the president of the East India Company factory in Surat, just, of course, north of here. And I think historians are well aware of this. It's really quite well documented, and people acknowledge the importance he played in laying the foundation of Bombay's later rise to greatness. And certainly his contemporaries recognized his importance and significance. Just a single quote to give you a taste, because I'm taking you back now to the 1670s, to the late 17th century, and John Fryer said, Aungier was a cherisher of ingenuity, of a generous and free access, masculinely candid, I'm not too sure what that means, a master of all languages and sciences, as well as skilled in military virtues. Interesting. So back in 2018, I actually published an article on Aungier, where I looked at his Irish background and how the experiences of colonial Ireland shaped actually the development of early Bombay. That work has been published in a journal called Past and Present. And if any of you can't access Past and Present because of a paywall, if you email me, I'm very happy to share it with you. So since I've written quite extensively about him, what I want to do this afternoon is to really look at his career as a merchant, as a soldier, as a statesman in India between 1662 and his death in 1667, and to ask whether he was as innovative, as informed, and as accessible as Fryer suggested. Now, in order to try and reconstruct his life and his lived experiences, we have to, of course, get lost in the archives. But sadly, there is a lot about Aungier that we don't know. We don't know the year in which he was born exactly, though we do know he was born in Dublin sometime in the mid-1630s. We have no visual representation, no portrait of him. So what I have here are portraits of other members of the elite who spent time in India or visited India. And, you know, we all have these sort of dreams. One day in somebody's attic, somebody might turn up a portrait of Gerald Aungier. And if they do, I suspect it might look a little bit here like the Earl of Denbigh, or the man on the right, Sir Robert Cowen, who was a very important Irishman and governor of Bombay in a slightly later period. What we lack with the visual, we have with the documentary. There is an extraordinarily rich archive documenting what Aungier does. It's part of the archive of the East India Company, and there are 27 miles of records. So imagine, you know, how far 27 miles would take us. It's way beyond from here to the airport. Now, I haven't looked at everything, of course, and not all of it relates to Aungier. There's also material here in Elphinstone College, and as you can see from some of the images, not always in great shape. And actually, I find it desperately sad as a historian to be touching materials that are literally turning to dust and crumbling. It desperately needs conservation. I'm also very conscious of the material relating to Aungier in the archives in Portugal, especially in Lisbon. I've done a little bit of work with the Portuguese material, and there's clearly much more there. But obviously, these are very much European archives. And when I was living here in India in 2014-15, I employed a graduate student who was fluent in local languages, actually to do a thorough search of the archives here in Mumbai and Surat, and nothing apparently has survived relating to Aungier from this early period. And, you know, if anybody in the audience has anything about Aungier, especially from the archives of Surat, I'd absolutely love to chat to you. I suppose the point I'm making is issuing that health warning at the outset. What we know about Aungier and early Bombay is very much through the lens of the European archives, and particularly the archives of the East India Company. And that's very unfortunate, but that's just the reality when it comes to the archival material. But we have other sources that we can look at. And here, some of the architecture is very important and significant. I don't know, has anybody been, it's hard for me to see, to visit the English cemetery in Surat? Yes, I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. And this is Aungier's tomb. I'll come back and talk about the tomb in a moment. But this is the other thing. These are some of the fortifications that date from the 1670s, and these are the Aungier's fortifications, the ones at Worley. And you actually can see them as you come over the bridge, as you drive in on your left-hand side. Not in great shape, but they're there and very much from this period. The other thing that is so important when it comes to studying 17th century India and, of course, Bombay and Surat are textiles. There are incredible textiles in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Basically, the East India Company gave all of its material culture to the V&A. And I've just picked out one exquisite wall hanging. You can see at the centre the Stuart coat of arms. So this would have been custom made for somebody in the East India Company. The wonderful flora and fauna, and then the pineapple in the middle. And they reckon that this was commissioned actually to celebrate the introduction of the pineapple into England in the 1660s. So again, I think we need to think about material culture as well. And every now and again, there are some very intriguing connections. This exquisite Mughal miniature, and here you have Jahangir with a Sufi, and then you have this European figure, and that European figure is, of course, King James VI and First, who was the King of England. He was a Scot. He was King James VI of Scotland, First of England and Ireland. And Sir Thomas Roe brought that portrait to present to the Mughal Emperor. And I love the way it appears then, of course, in images like this. But this mention of King James VI and First actually brings me back to Ireland, because Ireland was England's first colony, its oldest colony. Ireland had been colonised by England in the 12th century, but it was really under this man in the early 17th century that colonisation in Ireland reaches new heights. And Aungier was very much from Irish planter stock. So just to give you a little bit of context here on 17th century Ireland, it was very intensively colonised. It was all about the introduction of English law, English common law. The goal was to civilise, to Anglicise, all of this in inverted commas. It was about introducing the English language, English culture, English architecture, agriculture, and of course the English religion, which was Protestantism. But it was also about creating a subservient economy. So we see, in addition to cultural imperialism, economic imperialism at work in Ireland. So it was about the commercialisation of Ireland and the urbanisation of Ireland. What's happening here in Ireland in the 17th century, of course, will be very familiar to many of you interested in India and imperialism in a later period. So that's the world in which Aungier was born. His family were active perpetrators of English imperialism in Ireland. But he, of course, made his career here in India. And he did so thanks to his relationship with the East India Company. The East India Company was actually quite difficult to get into. It was a closed shop, mostly of English and London merchants, but Sir Joseph Ashe became Aungier's patron. He was probably one of the most important figures in the East India Company. He was a major textile merchant, and as I say, one of the largest investors. And so Aungier was extremely fortunate to have the patronage of Ashe, who did so much to promote his fortunes in the East India Company. Just want to give you a bit of a flavour of the extent of the settlements of the East India Company during this period. Obviously, this is where we are here, Bombay, here's Surat. There are many, many factories around the Indian coastline. But it really was Surat that was, and I'm quoting here, the most famed emporium of the Indian Empire. It really, in this early period, was the epicenter of trade, and especially, of course, textile trade. And remember, India clothed the world in these centuries. The proximity of Surat to the markets of Delhi and Agra, but also under Mughal rule, it was an extremely cosmopolitan trading community comprising Muslims, Hindus, Jains, Armenians, Parsis, Jews, Europeans, and other merchants from across Asia. But Surat also enjoyed an extraordinarily sophisticated commercial infrastructure with a very busy mint. It had very developed banking and insurance systems and very elaborate credit networks. Nothing like it existed in Western Europe, with the exception maybe of some of the Italian bankers or the Dutch Amsterdam bankers. I mean, what we see in Surat in this period is extraordinarily sophisticated. And after a period in Goa, it was Surat that Aungier came. He actually travelled out to India with this man here, Sir George Oxenden, who was very briefly the first actual founder of Bombay, but at this point he was president of the English factory in Surat. And Oxenden made Aungier his pupil. He literally took him under his wing, and it was really thanks to the support of Ash and Oxenden that Aungier just simply rose to the top of the food chain, much to the irritation of his peers. From his base in Surat and the neighbouring village of Swali, Aungier gained very practical experience of every aspect of trade and commerce, and he made, an enviable set of contacts with the merchant community. And basically his world revolved around the arrival of ships like this. This is an East Indiaman. They were floating fortresses and warehouses, enormous ships, usually 5 a year, sailed from London to Surat, with at least one stopping here in Bombay. Again, I don't need to stress just how challenging the voyage was, how long it took, the dangers that were faced, especially from pirates. But you also then had to deal with the monsoons. And as I say, a return trip could take about 18 months. I flew in from London this morning, 8 hours. It's just incredible to think that one way it would have taken me 7 or 8 months. So you can just imagine how that impacted on communications, because it gave then members of the East India Company based here in Bombay or Surat tremendous latitude, but also an opportunity to engage in a very autonomous way with local power brokers and others. But when the ships came in, there was a frenzy of activity, and what the ships were bringing in was basically silver bullion that came from the New World, from the silver mines of Potosi, which would be in modern-day Peru. The Mughals weren't at all interested in buying English woolens, and you can understand why. But of course, in return, they were shipping back spices. These were coming from Bantam, Malabar, also coffee. In this period, coffee came from Yemen, but from Yemen it was shipped then to Surat, and then from Surat it was shipped to Europe. But as I say, by the later 17th century, it was textiles, and this is where the company really made its money. It was trading Indian textiles. And the quantity just soars. I don't want to blind you with figures, but basically in 1666, the total quantity of calico imported stood at 250,000 pieces. Over the next 2 decades, it increased to 1.5 million pieces. And calicos and textiles accounted for 83% of the trade. So we see this calico boom exactly during Aungier's period in Surat and Bombay. Again, many of the techniques that we see being used today have been used for centuries. These wonderful images are actually from the 18th century. Some of it were coarse calicos that were used in the slave trade. Others were printed. And then, of course, we have this exquisite embroidery. The East India Company was importing roughly about 50 varieties of cloth. And these sorts of items were obviously luxury items created to order. Again, the workmanship, the detail is just absolutely extraordinary and exquisite. And I was chatting earlier to our Consul General. Ireland's leading designer spends probably about 3 or 4 months a year here in India and has all of her embroidery and beadwork done here in India. So it's wonderful to see that continue, albeit in a very different way. Now, Aungier's relationship with the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb was extremely important, as was the relationship he developed with Shivaji, the Hindu Maratha leader, who had attacked Surat in 1664 and again in 1670. So on the one hand, Aungier had to make sure he always stayed in the good books with the Mughal emperor. Equally, he was the one who resisted Shivaji's attacks in 1664 and 1670, but he also then needed to develop good relationships with him, and he did. Aungier comes to Bombay in 1670, and it had actually been given to Charles II. So Bombay had been part of the dowry that had been given to Charles II when he married Catherine of Braganza. He was given Bombay, he was given Tangier in the Mediterranean. However, Charles realized that he couldn't actually rule Bombay himself, so he then gave it to the East India Company on the understanding that they were allowed to practice Catholicism and that religious toleration would operate. But remember, the Portuguese had been here in Bombay for 125 years before the English had come. And what I'm going to show you are just some images of Portuguese Bombay and Goa, but also just this wonderful map. Remember, maps were tools of empire, and they were very closely guarded because of their commercial sensitivity. And just the sheer lack of detail in some of these maps, you certainly wouldn't want to be navigating using that as a 16th century Portuguese map. The Portuguese, when they came, of course, were primarily after spices, but they didn't hesitate to use brute force. Neither do the English, by the way. One of the characteristics of imperialism, wherever we look, is that violence underpins it. But here you have an image from Fort Aguada, which is hugely impressive. Obviously, it's still there, guarding the mouth to Goa. And these sorts of fortifications, whether they were built by the English or the Portuguese, were of these new style artillery fortresses. The other thing the Portuguese brought was godliness. And of course, so many of their churches and cathedrals survive for anybody. Goa is a fascinating place to visit. But you had quite a modest Portuguese settlement. The centre of gravity really was Goa. But in Bombay or Bombahia or Bombay, so you can see, obviously, Bombay, the Portuguese, They were leased to Garcia de Horta. Now, Garcia de Horta was an extraordinary character. He was a celebrated Portuguese physician and botanist who had fled Portugal in order to escape the trials of the Portuguese Inquisition. Basically, the Inquisition were very concerned about families who had converted from Judaism to Christianity. And that's why Garcia came here, because he thought he'd be able to stay, as far away as he could from the Inquisition. But you can see here his castle, the fort, which is now, of course, a naval yard. I still haven't managed to get in to see the fortifications that are in there. And that then became Aungier's base. So, Aungier took over Bombay. In the past and present article I explain how Aungier fortified Bombay. We saw some of the Worley fortifications. There were other fortifications around the seven islands. He also Anglicized Bombay and colonized Bombay as his grandparents had colonized Ireland. It's just as if it's intergenerational. I mean, 1630s Ireland is replicated in 1670s Bombay. And interestingly, he develops a mint. I was in London a few weeks ago, and I actually went to look at some of these coins in the British Museum. And it was absolutely fascinating to see them. They obviously are dating from Aungier's period, 1672, 75, 78. And what's interesting is he gives the coins English names. So the Anglina is the silver rupee. The copperoon is the copper coin, and the tinny is the you can see the little tinny down there. And he gave the coins English names because, and I'm quoting here, "For in this and in all things else we endeavour to entice people to teach them the English tongue." So that Anglicization and colonizing and civilizing agenda is very much at the heart of what Aungier was about here in Bombay. He also wanted to develop the town. Remember, at the end of the day, it's all about the economic extraction of whatever they can get their hands on. It's about making a profit, and that's what the East India Company is all about. And the speed with which Aungier manages to develop Bombay is something that contemporaries comment on. So a French priest comes to visit in 1672, and I'm going to quote here, and he believed Bombay would quickly become one of the sights of the country. John Fryer, who I mentioned earlier, worked very closely with Aungier during the 1670s, and he estimated that the population increased from about 10,000 inhabitants in 1670. By 1675, it had gone up to 60,000 inhabitants. I mean, that's a huge increase of population. Now, you always have to handle these figures, take them with a bit of a pinch of salt, but we see a very, very significant rise. And if 60,000 people were living here in Bombay in 1675, that's more than were living in Dublin. It really is a very significant size indeed. But above all, it was a cosmopolitan community of Hindus, Muslims, Armenians, Parsis, and those of mixed race, mostly Portuguese people, Christians who had married with the indigenous peoples. People came to settle in Bombay for a number of reasons, and they're very clear about why they settled here. One was they enjoyed, they could worship freely. So in other words, you had full religious toleration. Aungier was able to secure Bombay from external attack through these very sophisticated fortifications. But he also established a system of justice. Now, I've been to the law courts here, and it's very interesting to see how the law courts of Bombay are the basis for the whole Indian legal system. And again, that's Aungier's law code. I'm not going to talk about it this afternoon because I've written about it in the past and present article. But I mean, what he does is hugely significant. Also the fact that he establishes a mint here. It's the first mint established in what becomes known as British India. But he's also very careful to bring in different groups. So, for example, with the Parsis, he agrees to, and I'm quoting here, build a burying place for their dead on the islands. And what he's referring to there is, of course, the Tower of Silence on Malabar Hill. Now, each of these ethnic groups live separately, but where they do come together, of course, was in the bazaar. The English community, and they say it's an English community, but there's a load of Irishmen there. When you start to see O's and Macs, O'Donnell's, MacDonald's, Butlers, you know. But I love the way they're all dubbed English when, of course, that's not the case. But the European community was actually relatively small. It was probably only about 250 people living mostly in the castle and the area around the castle. As the city grew, oh, here we are. You can see very clearly this is the castle. And he developed, Aungier developed very sophisticated gardens. Obviously, there was obviously something there beforehand, but he really did develop them. What he was more concerned about was how you feed this huge population, and that became a real challenge. So Aungier was very careful to build warehouses. He regulated the price of goods, especially rice, which they called bati. He also arranged for the cultivation of grains, as well as fruits, alongside, of course, the ubiquitous coconuts. I always think you're back in Bombay when you come in from the airport and you see the coconuts. But in the 17th century, the islands would have just been covered in coconuts, and obviously very important for the economy as well. So he's very good at using what was here, but he also then wanted to open up new trade routes within India, but also with China, Siam, or Thailand as we know it, and the Arabian Peninsula. So he's constantly sending out these little trading parties to try and open up new trade routes. And he's always looking for new commodities to trade. And so we see things, especially opium oil and bang. You guys know what bang is. I have to explain that elsewhere, but that you can see that they're also looking for, obviously opium becomes huge later, but even in this early period. But once again, just like in Surat, it's the textile trade that's important here in Bombay. He encourages cotton and silk weavers to relocate here. He provides looms for free, and he brings in others who can gum and dye cotton yarn. In addition to textiles, though, he also lays the foundations for the development of the shipbuilding industry, for saltpeter and soap manufacture, the distillation of arak, and the production of toddy. So very, very diverse in the enterprises that he encourages. And he's very good at persuading diamond merchants to relocate in Bombay from both Goa and from Surat. It's very interesting when we actually look at some of the material that Aungier sends back, because it's very clear to me that he does acquire command of local languages and Persian, and he has a very deep appreciation of local cultures. His uncle, also called Gerald, was a very skilled linguist in Oriental languages, but Aungier has a particular interest in Zoroastrianism, and he's constantly sending stuff back to London. And there's this wonderful chronicle of the kings of Perseus that actually was sent to the librarian in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It's ended up in the British Library, but if you probably can't read it easily, but Aungier has appended a little note basically saying, this is a very important ancient writing. I've had it copied for you, and he sends it back. The one at the bottom, that Gurney Herbal, we don't know who sent that back to Sir Hans Sloane, who was another great collector in London. I suspect it was Aungier, just given the dates. But again, these are incredible. It's all about the extraction of knowledge and the collection of anything that might be useful for the company. The other thing that we know about Aungier is that he was a great collector. And we know that he collected Indian and Japan rarities. However, when he died, the company refused to ship them home because they were too numerous and very cumbersome. But we know from inventories that, items like this were amongst them. This exquisite cabinet, again, is in that collection in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And these sorts of expensive, exclusive items would have been used for giving gifts, and he would have received gifts, because gift giving and receiving was a very important part of diplomacy in that period. And we know that Aungier received some extremely precious jewels, exquisite carpets. This Fremlin carpet is 30 feet. It hangs from the ceiling. Absolutely exquisite, embroidered with exotic animals. You can see, maybe you can't see, there's a cheetah there, an ostrich, other rare birds. And again, it just gives you a flavour of just the sheer quality of this. But Aungier was always sending exotic gifts back to the king, and including a tiger. But the problem was getting the tiger home, because the tiger ate all the food that, so anyway, getting the tigers back to London was a challenge. But I mean, and the king's, what now is the main zoo in London, began as the Royal Menagerie with animals, many of them sent back by Aungier. Aungier, as you're probably getting a feel for now, hugely successful, but also he liked the good life. And the East India Company didn't approve of this, and they said it's profit, not grandeur, that is our end in trading. So basically they fall out. And in January 1676, Aungier replies to the East India Company that have been chastising him for basically spending too much money on gifts, on sending tigers back to London, above all on fortifications, which are hugely expensive. And he rather, I think it's a rather bold reply to London, where he's paraphrasing from the book of Ecclesiastes, and he reminds his colleagues in London of, and I'm quoting here, of the wise man's saying that there is a time and a season for all things under the sun, a time to plant, to build, to fortify, to defend a war, to be liberal, to show the solemnity of government. And during his 3.5 years, he was only in Bombay continuously for 3.5 years, he hath observed the rule of time, measure, and place to the best of his judgment. He hath never broken their orders, quote, by vain expense, or used more grandeur than his predecessors on this side, or equals on the other side of India have done. If he hath erred through want of experience, it will appear no wonder when it is considered that his calling is as a merchant, that he never professed himself a soldier, lawyer, philosopher, statesman, and much less governor. That's a really powerful response, but actually for me, it's so interesting, because even though he's saying, listen, I'm only a humble merchant, the truth is that Aungier actually did excel as a lawyer. He comes from a legal dynasty. He himself never attended the Inns of Court, but we know he was very skilled in the law. He was a very skilled diplomat and statesman and governor. And he did provide that critical leadership for Bombay at a very important moment in its history. But he also did worry about Bombay. And there's another lovely letter that he sends back to London where he says, the Bombay colony would fail because, I'm quoting here, of the pride and intemperance, ingratitude and laziness of the English. And I just thought for an Irishman, that was rich. So it's like, if it fails, nothing to do with me. It's all the English's fault. So I just want to sort of start to draw things to a little bit of a close, because I would like to leave a few minutes for questions if you have any. But I do want to reflect on Aungier's calling as a merchant, because it's very clear that in addition to laying, if you want, the economic foundations for Bombay's later growth, in addition to enriching the East India Company, that he also enriched himself. He had a fleet of 5 ships that he ran, exactly, and he did a lot of intra-country trading, especially into the sort of Yemen and the Middle East. He worked very closely with a number of Muslim and Parsi local merchants. And obviously, Rostam Manik was the Parsi broker for both the Portuguese and the English in Surat, and had a close relationship with them. What's not clear to me is how much money he actually made. But our friend, the French priest, Abbé Carré, suggested that he, in a single voyage, lost £45,000. Now, £45,000, bless you, is a lot of money today. I wish I could convert it into rupees. It's millions. It's, millions and millions and millions and millions of pounds. That was in a single voyage. I think that he died certainly as wealthy as Sir George Oxenden, who, when he died, left an estate of 300,000 rupees, which in sterling was about 40,000 sterling. Or Elihu Yale, who was the governor of Madras, who was the founder of Yale University, who left a similar sort of fortune. So Aungier was very much in that league. The company allowed these guys to trade privately, but I think as time progressed, Aungier was doing more for Aungier than he was for the East India Company, and basically that's why they fell out. And then, obviously, he realised it was time to go, and he resigned. However, death overtook him. He had suffered terribly from ill health during his entire time in Bombay, regularly from a form of beriberi, which left him partially paralysed. But it seems that dysentery finally killed him, as it did so many of his compatriots. He actually died in Surat in 1677, and there's no account of his funeral, but I'm assuming it was very similar to that of his predecessor and mentor, George Oxenden, when the people of Surat would have lined the streets, balconies and rooftops to pay their respects. This image is of a cortege of one of the 17th century Dutch governors, but I would imagine it would have been very much like this. Aungier leaves a will. I always love it when people leave wills. It tells you so much about them. He drew it up 3 months before he died, and he left 3,000 rupees, an awful lot of money, to cover his funeral expenses, but also the raising of a tomb. And this is the tomb that you saw at the beginning. It's extant in the English graveyard at Surat. It's extraordinarily impressive. It's a 2-story building. It's built by local craftsmen in the Indo-Islamic architectural tradition. A table tomb without an inscription occupies the center at the bottom, and you can see, the mosaics, these blue and white mosaics. The whole interior would have been magnificently decorated. Again, it's not in great condition, but I mean, it was incredibly impressive. Aungier never returned to Dublin, but he brought India to Ireland. And we have wonderful correspondence of him sending back these magnificent Indian tents made of calico. These aren't tents. It doesn't do justice to them. They're like these massive marquees. But he also sent some things like mangoes back to Ireland. I cannot tell you how exotic a mango would have been to somebody living in 17th century Dublin, never mind rural Longford, which is where the Aungiers had their estate. He also brought the wealth of India back to Ireland. And throughout the 1670s, he had been basically repatriating the wealth that he'd been making here as a merchant. And his brother had been using it to develop the first suburb in 17th century Dublin. And it's a street today named Aungier Street. Now, I'm not going to put Anita, our Consul General, on the spot by asking her, did you know that the Aungier Street is actually named after Gerald Aungier? Because the truth is, people in Ireland have no notion that when you see Aungier Street today, because you've got all of these 19th century facades in front of the original 17th century buildings, and we've no notion. I'm wondering if, oh yes, there you are. So number 9A, Aungier Street, is the only one that actually allows you to see. It's in dreadful shape. But you can see here the original 17th century fireplace. And obviously they've done a scientific analysis on all of this, so they can, the 17th century fireplace. Aungier Street was the poshest suburb in Dublin in the 1660s and 1670s. And all of that was developed on the back of treasure that Gerald Aungier sent back. And as I say, that story just isn't known in Dublin itself. And I'm just going to conclude with a final slide that sort of, I think, brings it home, because Ireland and India have had such close relationships since the 1670s. And yet in more recent times, I think we forget just how much we have, partly thanks or as a result of our shared imperial interests. But just to take you through some of these people, this man's Leo Varadkar. He was the Prime Minister, or the Taoiseach of Ireland, and he will be again in a few weeks. His family is from Pune, so his mother is Irish, his father is from here. Anyone recognize him? Shout it out. Do you recognize him? Kevin O'Brien. And Kevin O'Brien, playing the most imperial of sports, cricket, a sport that you guys are pretty good at as well. But Kevin O'Brien was the man who scored a century against England and Pakistan. So it's funny, whenever you come to India with Kevin O'Brien, cricket enthusiasts, of course, love him. I'm sure you recognize this man here as well. So there was a film called Ekta Tiger, which apologies for my awful pronunciation, and Salman Khan and Katrina Kaif came and they spent 3 or 4 months living in Dublin, filming this in my university. So we were sick of the sight of them with the greatest respect. But because there was I think it was called Banjara, there was a song that it played over and over and over again. You thought, oh my God, if I hear that one more time. But actually, actually, today it's really education that helps to bring us so closely together. And it's always a privilege for me to welcome Indian students to Trinity. This is actually at JNU when one of our former ministers for education came over. But I also take great pleasure in spending time here. I teach mostly in Delhi when I come, at Ashoka University and at JNU. But I just want to conclude with this image because I actually think one of the most significant things, this is a woman called Savita Halapanava. I don't know, again, if you recognize her or you know the story, but she died tragically because she was denied an abortion in 2012. But her death then was the catalyst for a referendum in Ireland that we had a referendum and abortion is now legal. And I think, you know, that slide just encapsulates the extent to which these relationships obviously flourish today, and that's why I'm so thrilled to be here because I just talk about them, but also to remind you that actually we have a very, very long history that begins in the 17th century. And sorry, Bombay Street, that's not in Dublin, actually. You'll have to go to Belfast to see Bombay Street. But the shared landscapes as well. It's partly a legacy of the British Empire. But also, as I say, I think the Irish were very much servants of empire, particularly here in India. But then, of course, we're subversives within it and helped, if you want, to teach the Indians their ABC of freedom fighting. So I'm going to stop there and thank you for your attention. But I'm very happy. We do have about 8 minutes. If anybody has questions, I'm so delighted to take them. And there's one at the front. I think there's a microphone, sir, just so everybody else can hear you. Thank you.
Is it? Okay. So, a quick comment. You mentioned the coins, the tinnies, but it's the Indian names, the pie, and the kauri, the kauri, which is in the English language. So, have you looked in that direction? And the question is, Ireland, for Ireland, and perhaps the most Western of the European nations today, how come it does not have a strong tradition of maritime adventure or trade? I don't want to use words, the linear direction, but how is it the English took over?
That's it. How many, I was going to say, how do I answer that question in 2 minutes? Very quickly. So Ireland is an island, and obviously our maritime heritage is hugely important. And Ireland, from very earliest times, would have had very strong links to continental Europe. So, I mean, we don't maybe talk about them enough, but they especially to France and to Spain. But obviously, once you're a colony, the colonizer is doing everything possible to control your relationships, especially with the Catholic powers of Europe. So it's a complicated one. Where the Irish are extraordinarily active, it's in the British Empire. Now, I've been talking about Bombay in India, but the Irish presence in the Atlantic world is huge. So, for example, in the Caribbean, in the 17th century, a third of all white people in the Caribbean were Irish. The vast majority of them were indentured servants. So it was the unskilled, the labourers, and many of them were there involuntarily. Now, that doesn't mean that the Irish weren't also active merchants and traders. Many were, both Catholics and Protestants. So the answer is the Irish have always been very entrepreneurial, always been great traders, but they've actually done a lot under, if you want, the guise of the British Empire. But the Irish are trans-imperial. They're very happy. Since we never had an empire of our own, what we always did was piggybacked on the empires of others. So you also find they're very active in the Portuguese Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, but even the Dutch Empire. So the Irish will pop up everywhere. There's, and then you, sir. So I think Anita and then yourself.
Thanks very much, Jane. I'm the Irish Consul General, and I'm really proud to be here today and to be supporting this lecture with Jane. And you mentioned at some point that that gifts were a very important element of diplomacy. And your presence here is a gift really to us today. So what I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned earlier in the lecture that India clothed the world. And I think the modern day, emanation of that is that India is connecting the world. I have such experience of Indian tech workers and people who are involved in the most innovative schemes really in Ireland. This same innovation I see also in Irish people. Do you think it's our colonial or our feudal past that gives us this fight, this kind of a shared quality?
I think absolutely, Anita. And I think when it comes to diasporas, it's interesting that you've got obviously the Jewish diaspora, you've got the Indian diaspora, and you've got the Irish diaspora. They're the three big. And I think the colonial legacy of the British Empire has undoubtedly shaped both Ireland and India, without a shadow of a doubt. Absolutely. Yeah. I think this gentleman.
Can I just ask my question?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry.
Would you like to go ahead?
No, I just wanted to mention that you didn't say too much about the way that the Indian independence movement was inspired by the Irish independence movement. And also, there's a place in Dakshai where the Irish mutinied,
That's right.
I think, and Mahatma Gandhi came and spent a night in the jail of the Dakshai, I think Dakshai there, and the next day or the day after, Winston Churchill, who was then ordered that one of the leading Irish mutineer be hanged.
James Daly was his name.
Yes, he was hung at Dakshai. So I just mentioned that.
Listen, I can give you another hour on that, but I'll try again and just answer it very, very quickly. But you're absolutely right. As I say, the Irish were subversives within empire, worked very closely with those in India who were looking initially for home rule. So Annie Besant, of course, Liverpool Irish, and the Indian home rule movement. But also Gandhi was extremely influenced by a man called Michael Davitt, who was the Irish Land League, and things like boycotting, passive resistance all came from what was going on in Ireland. The other links are, if you want, the cultural nationalists. So W.B. Yeats and Tagore were great friends. And obviously the introduction to Gitanjali was written by Yeats and won Tagore the Nobel Prize. I think, though, in terms of, if you want, militant republicanism, again, hugely important, the Bengali nationalists working very closely with Porrick Pierce, Michael Collins, and the other Irish nationalists. And there was a big rebellion in Ireland in 1916. You have a copycat rebellion in Chittagong in 1931. So you're absolutely right. And I'm not saying it was just Ireland, but I'd like to suggest that the Irish, if you want, taught the Indians their ABC of freedom fighting. They worked very, very, very closely together. And, there's a lot to be said on that. But thank you for raising that. I know we're running out of time, but please
just
go
one
ahead.
last question is, I wanted to know, you showed us a lot of the materials that, the gifts and materials that were sent to Ireland by Gerald Aungier. And also, what I wanted to know was, how did he transfer his funds there?
Mm-hmm. So how do you get your money back in an age of no banks? Obviously, you've got banking here as part of the Mughal Empire. The answer is you send it back in diamonds and precious stones, or you remit it. So you basically say to the East India Company, an IOU. And then, so the Earl of Longford used to hang out in London waiting for those big ships to come in so he could get his diamonds and his remittances from the East India Company. So no cash was changing hands, is the answer there. I'm happy to keep taking them, but I am also conscious that somebody's in this room after us. But please go ahead, sir.
Sorry, when is your book out?
Oh, the book. Thank you for that. So, the book. It's called Ireland Empire and the Early Modern World, and obviously will feature all of this. It's in production with Oxford University Press. With a bit of luck, it'll be out in June. So it'll be out soon. And hopefully, I'll tell the publicists, the press, you've got to get some copies in India. But the other thing we're doing is we're doing a 4-part documentary that we're actively filming at the moment called From That Small Island, The Story of the Irish. And this, the relationship between Ireland and India will be a very important part of the final 2 episodes. We're going back to earliest times, but the final 2, and there'll be a 90-minute feature. So hopefully we'll get to bring that back. That's being launched in March 2024 because, I think it's so important just to make visible all of these relationships and this shared history. Great, thank you very much. I think there was one more here. One more? Are we allowed one more? All right, quick.
Yeah. Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. I just wanted to ask you that there's a huge development going on as far as Indian students studying in Ireland. There's Trinity College, the Dublin, I can't
UCD.
remember. UCD, and I think 2 more. Yeah. Apart from that, there are a lot of IT people going and working there. And another thing is a lot of global companies are headquartered out of Clonakilty, Cork,
That's right.
and Dublin because of tax benefits, I think. So could you throw a little light on that, please?
Very quickly, and here our Consul General is the person to talk to, but obviously I can speak to the education piece. So as the founding Vice President for Global Relations at Trinity, I wanted to really develop this collaboration. And now we have very significant numbers of Indian students coming and studying not just at Trinity, but across the Irish universities. We have a very good stay-back policy, and I think that's attractive so people can work, obviously, and many will stay on. Although I think you have to be very careful about that. Ultimately, I think you don't want to do anything that adds to a brain drain. That's not what this is about either. And I'm very keen that there's reciprocity in any of these educational relationships. The tech sector is dominated, as the Consul General has said, by Indian colleagues, yes, and it's fantastic to see them just go from strength to strength to strength. And there's an extraordinarily vibrant. Just by concluding this, can you show of hands of how many have actually been to Ireland? If you've actually been to Ireland. Oh, well, a few. So hopefully, it's one of these countries, I think Indian people feel very comfortable, maybe not with the weather, especially a day like today. And people will, there's a very warm welcome. And I think that warmth that I feel when I come here, you'll feel it when you go to Ireland. But I know that we've probably overrun and somebody else is coming in. So maybe I'll stop now. Thank you.